أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين بالقاسم محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين لا سيما مولانا وسيدي صاحب العصر والزمان روحي وأرواح العالمين له الفداء أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. We continue in our discussion on knowing the Imam of our time, Imam al-Hujjah. May Allah hasten his advent and his return. And after going over the preliminaries about some of the important aspects of the birth of the Imam, the occultation, the philosophy behind why he has been put into this occultation, we had also looked at some of the signs, both the definite and the indefinite signs, which would be a precursor to his return. From last week, we mentioned that, and this is what we'll be continuing tonight and in our future discussions, we wanted to continue in looking at our responsibilities to the Imam. And we mentioned that just as those people who lived at the time of the Prophet, of all of the Prophets actually, or those who lived at the time of our final Prophet or the first 11 Imams, they all had responsibilities and obligations that they had due to the Imam or the Prophet of their time. Obviously, having an Imam or a Prophet present would be relatively easy to follow obligations or responsibilities because there would be a direct connection, facilitation with the infallible leader that God would have appointed. But as we mentioned that during the period of the ghaibat, the occultation of the 12th successor of the Prophet of Islam, that these responsibilities still nonetheless rest on the shoulders of the believers, and that they do take on a different role because of the fact that the Imam is in occultation. As a reminder from last week, we mentioned that there are two major books that we are referring to for the sources that we are going to be speaking about in this series of the responsibilities. And both of those are on screen. We have the one book which is called Mikyalul Makarim Fi Fawaid ad-Du'a lil Qa'im, the criterion of the nobilities on the benefits of praying for Imam al-Mahdi. This is available online as well, the English translation. It's a 2-volume book, about 1,000 pages. And you can also refer to The Last Luminary and Ways to Delve into the Light, which is a summary and a translation of Mikyal al-Makarim, also available on alislam.org for free reading and free download. So again, those books will form the basis of our discussion in these sessions. Today, when we would look at just two responsibilities that we have to the Imam. And the first one I want to look at is speaking about the Ahlul Bayt. Obviously, when it goes to speaking about the Ahlul Bayt, we as an extension relate that to speaking about the Prophet of Islam, and as an extension talking about Allah and obviously the religion of Allah. Obviously, when you look at the religion, when we look at down to our responsibilities, speaking about the Ahlul Bayt is like speaking about the Prophet because he is the teacher of the Ahlul Bayt. Speaking about the Prophet is as if we are speaking about Allah because he is receiving teachings from Allah about the various aspects of the religion. And obviously all of that goes, and the lowest common denominator is the religion of Islam. And so we have multiple traditions. Just want to bring out one of them for this evening that comes to us from the 7th Imam, Imam Musa ibn Ja'far al-Kadhim, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, in which he speaks of a metaphorical reality of what happens when believers gather together and speak about the Ahlul Bayt. And the hadith mentions that indeed when two believers in Islam meet one another and they remember Allah, and then they mention the greatness of us, the Ahlul Bayt, the 7th Imam says that no flesh remains on the face of Satan except that it gets wrinkled and his soul cries out due to the severity of the pain that he feels. Obviously, this is a metaphorical understanding what the Imam is talking about. But the first part of the hadith is obviously interesting because the Imam is showing us the importance of us as believers gathering together, even at home, not necessarily in a center, but gathering or whenever we talk, to talk and remember about Allah, to mention the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You know, many times people gather and it's for vain activities. We'll gather to discuss who won the hockey game, who won the basketball game, what's the weather like outside, what sales are on happening in the stores. What's on sale this week in the supermarket or in the department stores. And God forbid, maybe we gather together to talk about one another, to gossip, to spread rumors, as a community people love to do. People love to talk about other people because we have nothing else better to do with our lives. But the Imam shows us that when we gather, we should be remembering Allah. We should be speaking and reminding one another about the responsibility, the obligation that we have to Allah, to learn about Allah, to engage in His worship, to just speak of the bounties that Allah has showered upon us. And then, as the seventh Imam says, then also that we should mention the greatness of the Ahlul Bayt, to speak about them, to talk about their greatness. Obviously, in order for us to be able to talk about Allah, or to talk about the Ahlul Bayt, we have to know something about them. And that means that we need to educate ourselves about the religion, and that we don't leave it up to the member and only the scholars to come and speak about Islam. No, this means that each and every one of us has a responsibility and obligation to learn about the religion, to not just inherit it from our parents, to say that, well, I'm a Muslim because my parents are a Muslim. No, that we should know our religion inside out. We should be well acquainted with the teachings of our faith, and we should be able to gather with one another at home when we have gatherings, and we should be able to speak about the beautiful aspects of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And as the seventh Imam says, that this is something which hurts and troubles Iblis, Satan, because we know that his whole reason of being removed from the kingdom of God's mercy is the fact that he did not want to submit to the order of Allah. The act of sajda towards Adam was but one aspect of what Iblis refused to do. But obviously, when people gather to speak about Allah, to speak about Ahlul Bayt, to speak about religion on a whole, this troubles Iblis, because it was because of the fact that he had that arrogance, that pride, that he was removed from Allah's kingdom of mercy. And so when we gather to remember God, this really eats at him and it burns into him, because of the fact that it was because of the same reason that of his rejection of the blessings of Allah that he is now in the predicament that he finds himself in today. The next responsibility, and I'll end with this for tonight, is religious gatherings. And this is something sometimes that people think is a custom, is a tradition that people brought from back home, from another culture. Some people think the Thursday night gathering, for example, is a cultural phenomenon. People say, well, there's nothing in the hadith about a community gathering on a Thursday night to gather and worship God. People say that there are all of these events that we have in the calendar year, that these are just fabrications of people who had nothing else better to do, for example. And obviously we have an answer to that, and the answer is clear from the hadith, which tell us to gather, and that the Prophet would have gatherings, what we would call a majlis, a sitting, a session where we talk. The Prophet of Islam instituted this entire concept of gatherings of religious nature. We know that the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, a prime example is Nahjul Balagha, the compilation of the sermons, of the letters, of the words of wisdom of Amir al-Mu'mineen, that these had to be delivered at a time in his life when he was speaking to the community. We know that those sermons are within the latter days of his life, in that last 5 years after he's taken over the successorship of the community. But he had gatherings where he would speak to the community. And this is a tradition that continued for all of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, give or take depending on the political situation of the time. But we know for a fact that after Karbala happens, the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, as much as they were allowed to, as much as they had the ability based on the political circumstances, they had what we would call a majlis. They would have a gathering and they would speak about Karbala. They would speak about the teachings of Rasulullah. They would convey these to the community. So there is a clear indication in the hadith that these gatherings we have are not cultural. They're not just a thing that have been brought from overseas, that these are a part and parcel of religious teachings within Islam. In this hadith that we have, and I'll end with this, from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq, alayhi salatu wassalam, he asks his famous companion Fudail, he says, Tajlisun wa tuhaddithun? Do you, my companions, sit around and talk about us? Talk about the Ahlul Bayt, talk about Islam, talk about Allah? Do you have gatherings? And now keep in mind that the community was such, the followers of Ahlul Bayt, because we have been oppressed since the early days of Islam at the hands of other so-called Muslims. What we see today in the world is nothing new. This also was at the time of the Prophet. After his death, the Ahlul Bayt were oppressed. The followers of Ahlul Bayt were oppressed by those on the other side of Islamic spectrum. And so they could not always have open gatherings in the masjid. Something that we should cherish and value and make use of, which unfortunately many communities don't. This was not a luxury that the early companions of the Imams had. They had to have gatherings at home, sometimes in secret. So the sixth Imam says, Tajlisun wa tuhaddithun? Do you, my followers, sit and gather and talk about Islam, talk about the Ahlul Bayt, talk about this religion? Fudail says, Na'am, ju'iltu fadak. He says, yes, may I be sacrificed for you. This is the way they used to speak at the time of the Arabs, at the time of the Imams, where they would say this phrase, ju'iltu fadak, may I be sacrificed, may I give my life up for your honor. He says, yes, we sit and we talk about you. We gather, we have majalis, we have these sessions where we just sit and talk about the Ahlul Bayt, where we just talk about your teachings to keep them alive within our family, within our community, within our society. The sixth Imam has a very beautiful reply to Fudail. He says, Inna tilka al-majalis uhibbuha. Verily, I love these majalis, these gatherings. The sixth Imam is saying he loves these kinds of gatherings that take place. Right? It's because it's a gathering where there's education being imparted. It's a gathering where people are learning of their responsibility. It's a gathering where things of a haram nature, of a forbidden nature, aren't taking place. So he says, Inna tilkal majalis uhibbuha. And then he tells Fudail, he says, فَأَحْيُوا أَمْرَنَا يَا فُذَيْل فَرَحِمَ اللَّهُ مَنْ أَحْيَا أَمْرَنَا. He says, so O Fudail, keep our teachings alive. May the mercy of Allah be upon a person who keeps our teachings alive. So this becomes another responsibility that we have in the period of the ghaiba, the occultation of our 12th Imam, as the 6th Imam is clearly telling Fudail that you need to have gatherings, you need to have sessions where you sit and talk about the Ahlul Bayt, where you talk about Allah, where we talk about the religion. And the Imam shows that these are gatherings that he loves. In other traditions, the Imam is quoted as saying that there is a spiritual aroma that he loves to smell from these gatherings that emanates from the believers. Right? These are obviously of a metaphysical reality. It's not a physical, tangible commodity that we can, quantify. But the Imam is saying that he gains that sense of spiritual aura that comes from such majalis. And as he tells Fudail, they keep our teachings alive through these gatherings. When you look at our history, I'll end with this last point. When you look at the history of the followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we realize that we have always been at the end of the stick of oppression. From the time of the death of Rasulullah, all until the time, even until today. Many countries in the world today, followers of Ahlul Bayt, as we see in many countries, we don't have the freedom to speak about our religion, to practice it, to engage even in how we pray in the open. Many believers in certain parts of the world, they can't even pray openly like a Shia. Our adhan is silenced from the minaret, and the adhan of the other Muslims is trumpeted over ours. And many different communities around the world have faced this for the last 1400 years. And so one of the things that we have to realize is that as a responsibility, and this is what we're looking at, is our practical responsibilities to the Imam. Right? It's not enough just to make dua for the dhuhur of the Imam. It's a good thing to make dua, but That's one aspect. It's a good thing to write arida to the Imam, but that's a custom which can be done any day of the year. It doesn't help a community, it doesn't help the Imam. It's a personal thing that we have between ourselves and the Imam. But what is a collective responsibility, as the sixth Imam shows us, is to have gatherings, have these majalis, where we gather to speak about the Ahlul Bayt, to know our responsibilities, to recognize who the Ahlul Bayt are, alayhimus salam. And that if we follow these obligations, if we fulfill these things that the Imam and all of the Imams have told us, then we can definitely say that we are preparing for the return of the 12th Imam. But if we are not fulfilling these obligations, if we're not speaking about the Imam, we're not attending majalis where the Imam is being spoken about, we're not fulfilling all of the rights that we will be going through in this session and these series, then how do we expect the Imam to come? What are we asking for? What army is he going to be coming back to inaugurate? When people can't be committed to the Imam today, how does he expect to come back? And I give the example, I'll end with this, is when Sayyid al-Shuhada is invited to go to Kufa, 30,000 letters come to him. Not necessarily 30,000 people, because some letters were signed by an entire family. Some tribes signed a letter of maybe 100 or 1,000 people. We know that 30 or 20 or 30,000 individual letters comes to the Imam, but the number of people were far more than that. But when it came down to the wire, when push came to shove, who was there for Imam Hussein? Right? People of Kufa turned their back. Right? We come to Muharram and we say, Ya laytani kuntu ma'akum fa'afuza fawzan azima. Oh, I wish I was with you, Hussein, then I would have achieved a great success. Well, we have an opportunity as believers, as men and women, as I've talked about in the past, that women also play a role in the Imam's movement. We have a opportunity, a golden opportunity, to be better than the people of Kufa, to ask the Imam to come and to be there to support him when he makes his return. But obviously we need to know our responsibilities to the Imam, and that way we can fulfill the obligation that we have to the 12th Imam, which is, as we had mentioned in the beginning, not only a responsibility to the Imam, but this becomes a responsibility we owe to the Prophet, to Allah, and to the religion of Islam on a whole. I close and we ask Allah, as we continue and we conclude in this month of Sha'aban, with just a few days left of the month of Sha'aban, that Allah gives us the ability to continue our acts of worship in these last few days. We ask Allah that if we have not yet been successful in fasting of Sha'aban, that we have a great opportunity to fast the last 3 days, which would be Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And there is a great reward to connect the fast of Sha'aban with the fast of Ramadan. And so we ask Allah to give each and every one of us the ability, the health, and the energy to fast the last few days of the month of Sha'aban, to join our fast with the month of Ramadan. We ask Allah to forgive us any of our sins. We ask Allah that He accepts the du'as that we have been making in the month of Sha'aban. And we ask Allah to give each and every one of us the ability to witness the new moon for the month of Ramadan, to fast the days, to spend the night in worship and contemplation and reflection and in supplication, and that we can improve in our taqwa such that we can be worthy of being amongst the helpers and assistants of Imam al-Mahdi when he makes his return to bring about a reformation of humanity. رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا إِنَّكَ أَنْتَ السَّمِيعُ الْعَلِيمُ. As we close, let us recite a Surah Fatiha for the reward of all the deceased from our family, our community, our friends, the ulama and the shuhada who have left this world, including the shuhada who were killed in Bahrain just today. Let us also remember those shuhada with the Surah Mubarakatul Fatiha. But before that, as-salawat upon Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.